Alright, so we're solving for x. So we got ourselves the equation 3x squared minus 12x plus 9. Alright, so this is a factoring problem. And I know that it's a factoring problem because we have a quadratic equation, which is an equation that has an x squared in it, and that's the biggest exponent on the x. We also have 12x and a 9, so this is in standard form, which is when you have the x squared first term, and then the x term, and then the constant. So we have ax squared minus bx plus c here, which is a quadratic. The first thing you always want to look at when you're solving an equation like this is if you can factor anything out. And we can factor something out. We have a greatest common factor here. Every single term can be divisible by 3. So I can take a 3 out front, and that's going to leave inside. If I divide every term by 3, I get an x squared minus 12 divided by 3 is 4x, and then plus 3. So all I did was factor out a 3 there, and that's a really useful tool here because now we don't have a number in front of this x squared, which is going to make it much easier to factor. So this equals 0. So in terms of solving this equation, we can kind of forget about the 3 because we're trying to figure out what x equals, so we can divide both sides by 3 and the 3 just goes away. Because if we divide by 3 here, 3's cancel, and no matter what you divide 0 by, it's still 0. So the 3 just goes away, and we're left with this equation right here. We want to factor this, and the key to factoring is going to be to find two numbers that add to the middle term and multiply to the first number times the last number. Oftentimes in school nowadays they use this X method where you are looking for numbers that multiply to a times c, so the number in front of the x squared and the last number, which is just 3 times 1, which is 3, and numbers that add to this number, which is negative 4. The first thing you want to think about when you're factoring here is what the signs are on the two numbers. So we know that they have to add to a negative number and multiply to a positive number. So in order to multiply to a positive number, the signs need to be the same. They don't necessarily have to be positive, but if they're both negative, that would make a positive number as well. In order to add to a negative, obviously we're going to need some negative aspect. So we know that both numbers have to be negative because that's how you multiply to a positive and add to a negative. There's no other way to do that. So now that we know that both numbers are negative, we're looking for factors of 3 that add to 4. There's only 2 factors of 3. We only have 2 options here. It's 3 and 1. So negative 3 and negative 1 are our numbers that we're getting from this little thing that we're doing over here. And what this does for us is gives us the numbers in the factors here. So the way you set this up, factoring is breaking this equation into 2 separate equations that are multiplied together here, each of which has an x out front. Since we have no term out here, we don't need to do some of the harder steps that might happen in factoring, and our terms are just x minus 3 and x minus 1. At some point I'll get into what we call that factoring with a leading coefficient. When there's a number out front, things get a little more difficult when that's happening. So this is our factored form, and this makes it easier to solve this equation because we have 2 things that are multiplying together that equal 0. So if either one of these things was to equal 0, then the whole thing would equal 0, right? Because no matter what you multiply by 0, it's going to equal 0 no matter what. So now we can set both of these little terms equal to 0 and solve our equations, and that should give us our answers. So we got x minus 3 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. Again, because if either one of those terms equals 0, then the whole thing equals 0. And to solve this equation, we just add 3 to the other side, and the answer is x equals 3 here. And here we're adding 1 to the other side. The answer is x equals 1. We can check both of those to see if they work. I'm just going to check the 1 because that's sort of easy to plug in. Let's make sure we did our work right here. So if I plug 1 in here, we get 3 times 1 squared minus 12 times 1 plus 9. Well, 1 squared is just 1, right? times 3 is just 3, minus 12 times 1 is just 12, plus 9. Does that equal 0? Well, 3 minus 12 is negative 9, plus 9 cancels out, and that's going to equal 0. So those are our answers. X equals 3 and x equals 1. And that's how you factor with a leading coefficient of 1. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.